You've experienced it. Something happens, a harsh word, a sudden piece of bad news, a tone of voice that triggers something old, and within seconds you're somewhere else entirely. Rational thought has left the building, you're saying things you'll regret, or you've frozen completely, or you've left the room before you even decided to. Afterwards, when the wave subsides, you return to yourself wondering, where did that come from? Why couldn't I just stay calm? The frustrating answer is that in those moments, calm wasn't available to you. Not because you're weak or undisciplined, but because a part of your brain took over that is faster, older, and more powerful than the part responsible for composure. Understanding what actually happens in the brain during emotional flooding is one of the most useful things you can learn about yourself. Not because knowledge instantly produces change, it doesn't, but because understanding the mechanism removes the shame from the experience. You weren't failing. You were being run by a system you never consented to and were never taught to work with. That's a very different starting point. Neuroscientist Paul MacLean's model of the Triune brain, while an oversimplification of actual neuroscience, remains a useful map for understanding emotional hijacking. He described the brain as having 3 layers, each representing an evolutionary stage. The innermost layer, the brainstem or reptilian brain, governs basic survival functions, heartbeat, breathing, the fight-flight-freeze response. It operates automatically, without conscious input, and reacts to threat within milliseconds. Above it sits the limbic system, sometimes called the mammalian brain, home of the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the emotional memory system. This layer processes emotional meaning and social connection. Finally, the neocortex, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for rational thought, long-term planning, empathy, and what we think of as being ourselves at our best. The critical insight is that these layers are not equal partners. The lower layers are faster and more powerful than the upper ones. When the reptilian and limbic systems detect threat, they don't wait for the prefrontal cortex to weigh in. They act. The result is what feels like being taken over, because neurologically you have been. At the center of emotional hijacking sits the amygdala, 2 almond-shaped clusters of neurons deep in the temporal lobe, one on each side of the brain. Its primary function is threat detection. It scans incoming sensory information continuously, comparing it against stored memories of past danger, and fires the alarm when it detects a match. The amygdala's speed is remarkable. It processes threat signals approximately 0.07 seconds after they're received, fast enough to trigger a physiological stress response before the visual cortex has even finished processing what you're looking at. By the time you consciously register the situation, your heart rate is already elevated. Cortisol and adrenaline are already flooding your system, and your attention has already narrowed to the perceived threat. Daniel Goleman coined the term amygdala hijack to describe what happens when the amygdala's alarm response overrides the prefrontal cortex. The hijack isn't a failure of will, it's the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, prioritizing survival over reflection. The problem is that the amygdala can't reliably distinguish between a physical threat and a social one, between a predator and a dismissive email. It responds to both with the same urgency. And in a world where most of our threats are interpersonal rather than physical, that urgency is often counterproductive. The amygdala hijack isn't just a brain event, it's a whole body event. When the alarm fires, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, triggering the cascade of physiological changes we call the stress response. Adrenaline floods the system within seconds, raising heart rate, increasing blood pressure, and directing blood flow away from the digestive system and toward the large muscle groups needed for fighting or fleeing. Cortisol follows over the next several minutes, sustaining the elevated state. Breathing becomes shallow and fast. The pupils dilate, digestion halts, immune function suppresses, pain sensitivity decreases. At the cognitive level, attention narrows dramatically, a phenomenon called tunnel vision, designed to focus resources on the threat. Working memory capacity drops. The capacity for nuanced reasoning, empathy, and long-term thinking all decrease. John Gottman's research on couples found that once heart rate exceeds 100 beats per minute in a conflict, the ability to absorb new information, maintain perspective, or access empathy is severely compromised. The person is physiologically in a different state, and trying to have a productive conversation from inside that state is like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. Understanding this physiologically reframes self-blame. When you couldn't think straight during an argument, you were telling the truth. You literally couldn't. If the amygdala is the alarm system, the prefrontal cortex is the executive, the area of the brain responsible for rational thought, decision-making, impulse control, empathy, and the integration of emotion with reason. When functioning well, the prefrontal cortex receives input from the amygdala and provides context. Is this actually dangerous? What do I actually know about this situation? What are my values here? And what response would I endorse in retrospect? This regulatory function is what allows a person to feel anger without acting on it destructively, to feel fear without being paralyzed by it, to feel grief without losing their capacity to function. The prefrontal cortex doesn't eliminate emotional experience, it contextualizes it. The problem during an amygdala hijack is that the prefrontal cortex is effectively offline. Neuroimaging studies show reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex during acute emotional flooding. Resources have been redirected, the executive has been bypassed. This is why telling yourself to just calm down in the middle of a hijack doesn't work. The system that would execute that instruction has been taken offline by the system generating the problem. Recovery requires time, physiological de-escalation, and often physical distance from the trigger. The amygdala doesn't just detect current threats, it stores emotional memories with extraordinary vividness and retrieves them when the present moment contains echoes of the past. This is one of the most important and least understood mechanisms in emotional dysregulation. When the amygdala encodes a threatening or painful experience, it creates a memory trace that is fast to access and slow to update. The purpose is survival. If something hurt you before, you should be ready to respond quickly when something similar appears. The problem is that the amygdala's pattern matching is approximate rather than precise. It triggers on resemblance, not identity. This is why certain tones of voice, particular facial expressions, specific phrases, or environmental cues can produce emotional reactions that seem wildly disproportionate to the current situation. The reaction is proportionate to the memory it's activating. The colleague who dismisses you isn't just triggering the present moment frustration, they're re-triggering the much more loaded memory of being dismissed as a child by someone with much more power over your safety. The intensity comes from the archive. Separating what belongs to the past from what belongs to the present is one of the most powerful and most difficult regulatory moves available. Everything described so far, the amygdala's sensitivity, the prefrontal cortex's vulnerability to being overwhelmed, the persistence of emotional memory, might sound like a fixed system. It isn't. The most important finding in modern neuroscience for people working on emotional regulation is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change its structure and function in response to experience. The circuits involved in emotional regulation are among the most plastic in the brain. Studies on mindfulness practice show measurable changes in amygdala reactivity and prefrontal cortex thickness after just 8 weeks of consistent practice. Research on therapy outcomes, particularly in emotion-focused and trauma-informed approaches, demonstrates genuine changes in how the brain processes emotional information. Exercise has been shown to increase BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports neural growth in the prefrontal cortex. The nervous system that developed in response to your early experiences is not the ceiling of what's possible. It's the starting point. Every time you practice pausing before reacting, every time you name an emotion rather than acting on it, every time you seek co-regulation with a calm person rather than escalating, you are literally reshaping the circuits involved. Slowly, not always noticeably, but genuinely. The practical implication of everything in this video is a shift in strategy. Most attempts to manage emotions are essentially attempts to override the brain's alarm system through willpower, to force yourself to calm down, to think your way out of a hijack, to suppress the emotion through effort. This approach fails consistently because it tries to use the tool that's offline, prefrontal cortex, to solve the problem caused by the tool that's running, amygdala. Working with your brain means working at the level of the nervous system first. Physiological de-escalation, slow exhalation, physical movement, cold water on the face, or simply time and space restores prefrontal function before any cognitive intervention can be effective. Only once the hijack has passed and the system has returned to something closer to regulation can thinking, reframing, and problem-solving have any real effect. This is not weakness. This is accurate neuroscience applied to daily life. The person who steps away from the argument to walk for 20 minutes isn't avoiding it. They're doing the one thing that gives them a genuine chance of engaging it well. Tomorrow's long-form video will go deep into the practical tools, the specific evidence-based techniques that work with this biology rather than against it. The science you've understood today is what makes those tools make sense.